Hello there, and good evening to everybody. Welcome to today's Lewis Masterclass, Pandemic Insights. Today we're going to be discussing an extremely relevant and actual issue, actual topic. We're going to be discussing about disinformation and truth. In fact, the title of this masterclass is Confronting Indifference toward Truth. Well, and it's as I mentioned, it is extremely actual and important because, you know, we've been living in so-called post-truth era. We've been discussing about disinformation. We've been, you know, discussing about issues about how to reach and how to diffuse the truth. And this is and the issue of disinformation and truth or post-truth has become center stage in the political debate, but also in the public debate. And I have to say that the current pandemic has further amplified the importance of this issue. We've been exposed to data, metrics, indicators about the pandemic, which in turn have spurred debate about the truth behind this indicator, this data, this information. And in a way, it has also spurred a kind of new geopolitical balance amongst the different countries who were proposing different way of measuring or understanding the pandemic. In fact, well, as early as or as late as last week, we've been discussing in a different masterclass the role of metrics to understand phenomena, and particularly this pandemic. And one of the conclusions was that metrics do represent and do constitute an important language to create a culture of measurement, a culture of metrics, but at the same time, they're extremely important as keys to understand, in fact, phenomena. So, and today we're going to be working with two eminent colleagues. The pleasure to introduce to you the two speakers. We have Professor Ian McCarthy, who is a professor at Lewis, and also he holds a chair at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, and in fact is connected from Vancouver this evening. And in fact, I think it's morning in Vancouver now. It's 9:30 in the morning. And Ian has been working on innovation, social media, and more recently has been discussing in his work about the role of disinformation within organizations. So we're going to be having a perspective, if you wish, a managerial perspective on disinformation, and he's going to be joined by his kind of matching partner, his honor guest is going to be Gianni Riotta, who is the director, is a professional journalist, and has been working for a number of national and international newspapers. But he's also the director of the Lewis School of Journalism, and he holds a chair, the Pirelli Chair in Data Journalism at Princeton University. So we'll have I do think, very interesting discussion about disinformation and about how to get to the truth. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Ian. But before doing that, I'll ask all the people listening to us and assisting to this interesting masterclass, if they want to place a question, please do it by texting your question to this number who is showing now on the monitor. So now the floor goes to Ian. Ian.
Thank you, Andrea. Hopefully everybody can see my slides. So as it's a pleasure to be part of this program and to talk on this topic. When you look at what indifference to truth means, that it includes things like misinformation, disinformation, lying, fake news, deep fakes, post-truth world, post-fact world. In fact, a number of those comments or those terms are only new to us in the last few years, and this is because of the world of social media and the world that we face ourselves in terms of how we present information. I want to talk about one particular type of indifference towards truth, and here are some of the sort of key works that have come out in recent years from very eminent scholars around the world, from some of the world's leading universities. And the key word here is bullshit. I don't use this word to be provocative. I don't use it to be rude. It is a very precise and important conceptual form of misrepresentation or indifference towards truth. And one of the key things is that if you want to understand how to stem the production and spread of indifference, misrepresentation towards truth, you have to understand what you're dealing with in terms of the type of misrepresentation. One of the key works I'm going to sort of refer to all the way through is the book on the bottom right by Harry Frankfurt, who is a very eminent professor of philosophy at Princeton University, and most works dealing with misinformation and the phenomena of BS will defer to this work in terms of understanding what it is. So what is BS? Well, we've written a paper very recently, a paper that came out just a few months ago and is getting a lot of attention in the media, social media. Lots of colleagues and practitioners around the world are sort of sharing this at the moment. And what I'm going to talk about is reported in this particular paper. If you need a copy, just contact me and I will gladly share it with you. In terms of understanding what BS is and how it's different from other forms of misrepresentation, when you look at the work of Harry Frankfurt, it's very clear that it's not the same as lying. Lying is an act where the liar knows what the truth is and tries to subvert it in some way. And I will give some examples. So a liar must know or have a good sense of what the truth is or what the facts are or what the evidence is to be able to lie. And so that is a very clear distinction, because someone who is BSing has no regard for and is not constrained by the truth. They are just making stuff up. They're making stuff up and they could accidentally turn out to be correct because they just made it up and it just happens to be right. But they have this complete freedom to say whatever they want in a way that they want, because it suits their agenda, their personal agenda, their leadership agenda, their political agenda, whatever the agenda is, they want to make it appealing, and they are completely unconstrained by the truth. And one of the important things that comes out is that people who are producing and spreading BS can sometimes be spreading something which is actually correct, but it's by accident. It's not by design, because they didn't know what the truth is. So a very simple example, I'm going to give two examples. Imagine an organization is facing a big strategic change, like a merger, like a takeover, and it's giving a presentation. The leader is giving a presentation to the workforce, and someone says, will there be job losses associated with this strategic change? And the leader responds, no, there will be no job losses. Now, if the leader knows that there will be job losses because there's a plan, a decision has been made, and there is a schedule to roll out job losses, then the leader is lying because they know this truth and they are hiding or manipulating it. And so the leader is lying by stating known untruths. But if the leader doesn't really know whether there will be job losses because it hasn't been discussed, it hasn't been finalized, no decision has been made, but the leader says there will be no job losses, then the leader is BSing. They're doing this because they don't want to appear to be negative, they don't want to share bad news. Whatever their agenda is, they are just saying, making a statement that is not grounded in truth because they don't know what the truth is. And they're doing it because they care about how they're perceived, they care about their own particular agenda. But they could also be true. They might say, no, there won't be, and it just turns out there won't be job losses. A very famous actual example in 2018, as part of the discussions for NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico. During one of the conversations, the US president told the Canadian Prime Minister that the United States had a trade deficit with Canada. And the Canadian Prime Minister said, no, that's not true. And the American president said, yes, it is true. It certainly is true. But then just a few days later, the US president at a fundraiser admitted that he had no idea if there was a deficit. He didn't know. He didn't know what the numbers were, what the figures were, and that he just wanted to counter and refute whatever the Canadian Prime Minister was saying. And because he had no idea, he could accidentally turn out to be true if he knew what the data was. And so leaders who BS are sort of not constrained by truth. They have the freedom to say whatever they want. This can also mean that they're more dangerous in terms of what they can say, what they can't say. It's also likely that they're more common. It's a more common form of misrepresentation than lying. In terms of the class today, one of the things I want to do is sort of just draw upon some of the key sort of guidance issues about how we can respond to BS in the workplace, but also society, media, and more generally. A couple of papers I'm going to talk about in terms of key takeaways. John Petrocelli says, why do people BS? When do they BS? Well, if you work in an environment where you're expected to have an opinion, it's not appropriate to say, I don't know. You're expected to go to meetings, you're expected to do your work, and you're meant to have an opinion. Then people who are too afraid to say, I don't know, I don't understand, I'm not sure, then they will say things with confidence, they will say things with verve, and they will put forward things that are more likely to be BS rather than simply saying no. People will also do it when they expect to get away with it because they won't be punished by it or they won't be reprimanded by it. And also when they perceive that their audience is unknowledgeable about the topic, they're more likely to pass it around. So John Petrocelli there did a number of experiments to sort of prove when are people more likely to engage in this form of communication. Pennycook and colleagues also wanted to understand who's more likely to believe this form of communication. And it comes down simply to your mindsets. On the one hand, if you're somebody who's very open-minded, but in an uncritical way, and you lack strong cognitive processing capabilities, you're more likely to believe this form of communication, these forms of statements. Conversely, if you're somebody who has high analytical mindsets, you're critical, you're skeptical, you're more likely to be upset by or notice or understand these forms of communication. Another study that came out just last year was a study which looked at 40,000 teenagers in English-speaking countries around the world. And what they did was they presented them with sort of mathematical statements which were completely made up, complicated, sophisticated mathematical statements, completely made up. And they asked people to sort of say to what extent they had expertise or knew how to solve these. And what they found was that people from more social economic backgrounds were more likely to engage in bullshitting and say that they knew and that they knew the outcomes of these mathematical problems. Males have a greater propensity to do it over females. They also looked at the characteristics of the individuals, the personalities. If the individuals were people who were overconfident, very socially connected, felt that they were hardworking and could persevere at tasks, these were also individuals who were more likely to engage in this form of misrepresentation. And unfortunately, as you'll see there, is that North America, and in particular Canada, had a greater propensity to engage in this form of misrepresentation, whereas England, New Zealand, and Australia less so in the middle. And the countries of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Scotland were the least likely. So there's also a cultural aspect in terms of our ability to tolerate or engage in this form of misinformation and misrepresentation. Drawing upon such research, the work that I did with my colleagues was we put together a framework which talks about how employees, leaders within organizations should engage in comprehending, recognizing, acting against, and preventing bullshit. And it's a 4-step framework. And the first thing is that you should understand that BSing is a particular form of representation which is not lying, that the communications themselves are often beneficial, confirming, and credible. Secondly, that when you're recognizing it, you should expect it because it's common. The statements will be abstract, lack sources, logic, be riddled with acronyms and jargon, and also that people do it knowingly and unknowingly. The third point is to deal with how people act on it. Some people will exit, some people will voice, some people will be loyal to it. Exit means that you had enough, you leave the company. Voice means that you say that's not true. Loyal is that you have loyalties to the leader or loyalties to the BS because you find it appealing, it suits your mandate in terms of how you're going forward. And then preventing is then having a culture where you value expertise over opinions and hunches. You encourage critical thinking, you prohibit excessive jargon and statistical trickery. And so just to sum up, 5 don'ts, don't confuse BS with lying and other forms of representation. Don't forget, it can often be appealing and turns out to be true that people knowingly and unknowingly engage in this form of misrepresentation. Don't listen and read with an uncritical open mind. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know or I don't understand. 5 do's, do call for question, logic, and reject simple anecdotes which guide things. Do be alert to inconsistencies, biases, and vague, and proportion your belief to the availability of evidence and veracity. Okay. And finally, understand how your colleagues are acting to it and understand the consequences of having too much of this form of misrepresentation in your workplace, in the community, and in society. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks very much. It's very interesting what you just discussed and illustrated to us this idea of distinguishing between different forms of misinformation or disinformation, and also trying to get into which are the antecedents of this approach. Really, it gives an interesting perspective to understand which are the different dimensions that characterize the current era, which I do think is also has been amplified by the pandemic, and also thinking about the importance of the internet and social media that may in fact diffuse this kind of forms. I also appreciated a lot when you talked about the antecedents, the importance of peer pressure, so the characteristic of the environment where you operate, as well as the features of the people that stand around you. So the old concept of economy, the asymmetric information. If you are confronting someone who doesn't know, makes probably you feel, say, more prone or more inclined to misinform or disinform people. Cultural traits also very much important. And I wonder whether personality is also as important. Is as important as the other antecedents. But it's something that we probably we can address afterwards. Now I'd like to hear from Gianni Riotta, who is also on the other side of the Atlantic, is calling in from nearby New York. It's a sunny day in his place now. So Gianni, I would like to hear about
Okay, thanks very much to Rettore. Thanks much for inviting me. And to Professor McCarthy, it was a brilliant presentation, but Professor, you made a terrible mistake because Louis, it's really engaged full force on the disinformation fight. We've been partnering with the European Union, and on May 21st, we'll have a e-literacy that will be opened by the Rettore, and of course we have the Centro di Eccellenza Leteia working with different partners. So Ian, by now you don't know it yet, but you have been enrolled in all this fight. As soon as you come back from Vancouver, you'll fighting along us, because we really need partners. And listening to what you said, I was thinking of when I was a young student, before many of you listening now were even born. And for 5 years of my life, I studied the concept of truth in formalized languages. That is a pretty arcane topic, dealing with what is true in mathematics, what is true in formalized languages, and like logics and stuff. And then when I decided I was too stupid to be a philosopher, so I became a journalist. For many, many years, I thought that I totally wasted 5 years of my life until about 10 years ago, the disinformation campaign struck. And all of a sudden, all those studies and all those arcane stuff pretty much popped up. And so this is for Rettore, that in life, whatever you study, sooner or later will come back to you and be useful. At the time, when I was young, it was, of course, very prominent, the postmodernist school of thought that is still very strong in American campuses, dealing that there is no truth. And pretty much a novel like War and Peace by Tolstoy and the front page of the New York Times are pretty much the same thing. It's a narrative, as Derrida taught us. By the way, Derrida's sister died of coronavirus just a few days ago. And the postmodernists think that the truth is just a narrative that is like, you know, a majority of people agree with. I didn't believe that at the time, and I still don't believe it. And I was pretty much a follower of the of what Aristotle says as the classic concept of truth in his metaphysics. And Aristotle says brilliantly, to say of what it is that it is, and of what is not that is not, is true. And to say of what it is that is not, and of what is not that it is false. And this is pretty much, you know, a principle that solves all the questions and all the campaigns about disinformation. The only problem is that while on the metaphysics of Aristotle, this works pretty well, once you get into the web, this doesn't work anymore. Because to agree on what it is and what is not is almost impossible and is intractable. And why? I don't want to give you examples. The MIT in Boston just published a huge study that I'm glad to share with anybody that is interested, proving that disinformation travels much faster than good quality information online, and that people tend to share disinformation and to believe disinformation to a much higher degree than qualified and established quality information. So where a lot of my friends and colleagues that are trying to tackle the problem with the banking, you say A and A is wrong and false, and I say B and I will debunk you. The reason why they are failing, and all the efforts of the European Union, the European Commission that is spending an awful lot of money on the banking so far isn't working, is because people want to believe disinformation. It's not that they are misguided and that you show that actually France and Germany are investing 100 billion euros in Italy. They want to believe that this is a Soros plot, and actually they've been misguided. So what we have to study in the next future, and that's why, Ian, you most welcome in the team, because you exactly follow the right pattern of fighting disinformation. We have to find out why people prefer disinformation to information. In the Gospel of St. John, there is a line that is brilliant. There are two lines that are pretty brilliant. You don't have to be a Catholic to admire them. St. John says, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And that's exactly true. Of course, the phone now is ringing, but we will shut right away. And but the problem is that can you hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. The problem is that
Now we stop hearing you. We do have a connection problem with Gianni Riotta. Let's see whether we can fix it. I'll start, because we started receiving questions from the from our audience, and in fact, the first one is for Ian. And Paolo is asking you, Ian, based on the Petrocelli paper that you shared, what do you think may be the most common cause of the government BSing during the COVID-19 emergency? So is there any other causes that you think governments have somehow pushed government to disinform or misinform citizens, if you think it has been the case?
So the first, if I practice what I preach, I would say, I don't know. We don't have the evidence. All I can do is speculate and offer conjectures around it in terms of doing things. But it's very political. There's incentives associated with the data. There's incentives associated with the strategic actions. My sense is that we'll find out that the communities, the countries around the world that responded better would be evidence-based, science-based, and led by experts in terms of making decisions. And so the extent to which a politician not grounded in the expertise is making communications and making statements, or to the extent to which you have chief medical officers on the stage in terms of going forward. I'd imagine that's the criterion, and that reflects the culture of particular government, not necessarily the countries, but probably the sort of government organizations at the time, in terms of who is allowed to be the voice of what the information going forward. That you'll see in the papers and in the media that they also argue that female leaders of certain countries, New Zealand and Germany, and everything else, etc. So that could be anecdotal. It's not necessarily evidence, but it's something to be explored in terms of going forward. And if you look at the study I mentioned, which looked at teenagers around the world, in the English-speaking world, we found it was shown in that particular evidence, or found support that confident, socially driven males, teenagers, are more likely to engage in this form of misrepresentation than females. And so these are sort of little potential insights, but in terms of going forward, and again, it will require, like many things to do with COVID, there'll be lots of studies and lots of analysis afterwards, and hopefully we'll get evidence-based to answer that question. But what I offer at the moment is purely conjecture based on what I know.
Thanks very much, Ian. We keep receiving questions, and I guess I can pose to you this other question. Is from Francesca, who says, during the crisis we saw that information was fundamental to the efficient management of the crisis. What do you think this means for the future of communication? So is there anything that we can speculate upon, given the experience of each of us around the world with the crisis and how the government have taken them?
Gianni's comments sort of touched on this. He talked about how palatable, how pleasant or appealing the information is, and many leaders in organizations and countries and governments, there are consequences of being the voice of unpleasant, inconvenient truths. And so in terms of framing it, so I think as a society, as individuals, we have to be able to recognize that, one, truth is imperfect. It's never really black or white, in the same way as and data collection is imperfect. It can be, and we have to be as individuals more critical, more skeptical, but in a positive way, not in in a way where we want to learn. And one of the beautiful things about universities is that they're producers and disseminators of imperfect truths that are always changing and always being refined, and that's the mission of universities. And that's why sometimes academics are very difficult to deal with, because they have these minds that are very critically skeptical minds, and they want to know the evidence in terms of going forward. And so to some extent, society will have to raise its game in terms of how it consumes media on social media, the newspapers, the television, and understand when it's entertainment and when it's important in terms of making decisions in personal life or national life.
Very good, interesting. Thanks, Ian. So we have Gianni back, which is good. We were stopped when you were discussing about the St. John's Gospel.
No, very briefly. St. John says, of course, to anybody that is listening, it is clear that I was interrupting while I was discussing this information, because this is a disinformation plot, okay? You cannot think that it's just by chance that I got disconnected while I was debunking this information. So a whole plot can start from here. St. John says, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. At the same time, he says, people prefer darkness to light. And that's the point why it's so difficult to tackle this information, because people make a choice. People make a choice to choose something that is easy to understand. The Chinese spread the virus. The Americans spread the virus. The virus was built in a lab by the doctor at the Wuhan Virology Institute. This is much easier for people to accept than that there is nature, the way viruses spread that scientists don't exactly know yet. And so we have to accept that people form their own opinions in a much more complicated way than we used to think. And so tackling this information will be very difficult. But if we don't, we lose democracies, we lose open societies, and we lose higher education too. And I was saying, Rettore, while closing, that there are studies, and I can share them with you, that audiences following on TV, anchormen on American TV, preaching that there was no pandemia, that the virus is like the flu, are actually dying at much higher rates of audiences tuning into anchormen saying, well, wash your hands, wear a mask, stay away from crowds. So we used to say that disinformation kills, and it was a slogan. Now we know, and we have data to prove that actually disinformation kills scores of people during the pandemic, and that's one more reason why to fight.
Thanks, Gianni. It's very illuminating in respect to a lot of measures that have been taken at the supranational level. We talked about research and investment and done by the European Union to debunk disinformation or misinformation. But nonetheless, you said there is an issue which is down to people choice, to people preference, to, in a way, to prefer, as just to equal what you just mentioned regarding St. John's Gospel, people prefer darkness to brightness, which is quite scary in a way. We do have another question, actually quite a few, but this is interesting, from Alessio, who asks, how have companies and the mass media changed their communication approach during this crisis? Have you observed from your privileged, say, posts, any change in the way companies have changed their communication approaches? Ian?
Again, it's just a sense in terms of, and again, so just to give an example, I'm in a position now where I'm expected to provide an opinion, and while I do have some expertise in this, I have to caveat it all the time, and it's not a cop-out. But I would say that there's two things happening. There's two extremes. There's more misrepresentation, where people are, they're taking advantage of this politically for agendas and mandates, etc., etc. And then there are certain outlets which are trying their hardest to be sources of knowledge and truth, and they're working hard. And there's two extremes, and that goes for companies too. I think some companies, there's a very famous sort of Twitter spread from a frozen meat packing company of all things, and they've been tweeting about what is misinformation and what is Twitter and sort of what is science, and trying to educate the world. I will share the information later, but it's gone viral because this strange company, which is facing times, is trying to educate the world in terms of how to interpret the news and to try and interpret what is happening in terms of data around what's going on in our lives. You know, most people didn't know what exponential growth is. Most people still don't know what exponential growth is in terms of going forward, and don't understand logarithmic scales. I think in terms of organizations, I'm not too sure. You know, I can only talk about the organizations I deal with personally. Some are trying to be more authentic, but when you be more authentic, sometimes that involves darkness. It means inconvenient truths have to be shared in terms of going forward. Whereas many organizations, they say they're here for you in these challenging times, and you're our valued customer, and we love you. But the reality is different from that actual statement in terms of going forward. So I think the crisis is propelling people into two extremes. Either being more appealing BS and misinformation, or people working hard to actually try and be sort of advocates for truth and knowledge and fighting against it. And so this is a very topical phenomena happening at the moment.
That's very interesting, Ian. Gianni, what do you think about the changed or unchanged communication approach by companies in this era?
Andrea, both media companies and other companies will have a lot of change to tackle. Just very briefly on the media, talking about the Italian case. You all read about when Prime Minister Conte was, ready to impose a lockdown on Italy, that scores of people, of Southerner like me, left Milan, left the north, left Turin, and TV showed scores of people running to the trains, and the newspapers said like, oh, there is a huge number of Italians going south. As you can see, there is no pandemics in the south. And when this researcher, Jaime Alessandro, for La Repubblica, using the data on geolocalization of a Swiss company, a Swiss media company and data company, proved that actually the day that the old media, us in the old media, was saying that there was the huge escape from the north to the south, less than 200 people left the north. Less than 200 people left the north. But of course, when you see 200 people rushing to the station and you have a TV camera, that sounds like quite a lot and can be pretty impressive. But now we know exactly when people left. Of course, we don't know who left because this data are protected by GDPR, so they are anonymous. But at the same thing, today on the New York Times, there is a study that shows exactly how many New Yorkers like me left New York and where they went. So this is how the new journalism will work. There will be a reporter finding the narrative out from data. The same thing is happening with companies. Today, the Financial Times reports that Walmart hired 230,000 people. Amazon hired 100,000 people. And there are companies that are, of course, hiring. Tyson Food, that is the company that serves meat to all American meals, is hiring like crazy because they have to butcher more and more meat for people that are staying at home. And of course, there is a different chain of distribution between restaurants and homes. So, and if you look, and I'm done, Andrea, if you look at advertisements, both in Europe and the United States, you see that the narrative of advertisement totally changed. It's a totally different, because they're trying to sell stuff, of course, but they know that their audiences and their customers have a different mind frame right now. So for my old job, for media, there will be a totally new market, but even for ordinary companies and for distributions, there will be a totally different landscape.
Thanks, Gianni. We do receive a lot of questions. We'll try to address hopefully all of them. I just wanted to change gear now and go back to a piece of news which I've read relatively recently. I've read, in fact, that Yale University a few days ago has launched an online course on understanding medical research. Your Facebook friend is wrong. And currently, this course is already, well, starting today, by the way, on May 19th, is already 23,000 students enrolled. Now, and going back to your point, the fact that you said, well, people somehow seems to be inclined, prone to believe into misinformation. This number, these figures, of course, they're not many, but still it's just one course which is launched online. So, potentially can reach out a large number of students and people interested in medical research. It does show an interesting, I think, an interesting perspective on what we're saying. So that this pandemic probably may push people to adopt a different kind of approach towards science, and particularly towards research, or even more particularly towards medical research. What's your take on it, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to it, one of the books I showed on my slides was a course in Seattle, Washington, which was Calling BS, and it's basically along the same lines, but more general, to basically allow you to understand knowledge in a critical way in terms of going forward, and to be skeptical, or to be a skeptical learner. I think the challenge is that it requires work to develop a mindset and capabilities to sort of process and test information. You have to, it requires work to say, who is saying this? Why are they saying this? What is their logic? What is their reason? What is their agenda? That all requires work and time, whereas if it's BS or misinformation and it's devoid of the truth, it can be framed to be appealing, triggering, frightening, and it's given us complete freedom, and you just take it in terms of going forward. And so that's the key challenge, is that courses like this are great, and we need to be able to much earlier along in terms of high school and elementary school, is to be able to develop a nations of people who are sort of much more skeptical in a way that they question the who, the why, the what is their agenda in terms of going forward. And so this course is an attempt, but I think we need to start earlier, much earlier in terms of going forward with pre-teenagers.
Thanks. Interesting, Ian. So you basically you're shining an interesting light on the role and importance of education, starting from say primary education onwards. And interesting, another point, that the concept, I was smiling because you mentioned that we need skeptical individuals, and skeptical students. I do remember when I was a PhD student and discussing with my research result with one of the guru of innovation studies, Richard Nelson at Columbia University, by the way. He said, and I said to him, well, I'm actually disappointed by my results. Well, and then he said to me, well, you should be skeptical, not disappointed about research results. So that's an interesting line that me. Gianni, what do you think about this possible change of inclination of people towards research, towards science?
Andrea, this is crucial. And I'm very excited that Ian is stating this, because, again, on the 21st, we are putting together, Luis is the host, and there are Morgan Stanley as bank, and there are the Italian army. There are so many different friends chipping in. So I encourage you to join to the e-literacy day, because you see, that's exactly the point that Ian made, that people use the web, and they dig for information on the web, but nobody ever educated them to have their own media diet. If you think that 60 years ago, 70 years ago, mass media were invented, because when Professor McLuhan, a Canadian, by the way, said that there is a global village, that the medium is the message, and all these studies, mass media were something new. But in less than half a century, we passed from mass media, meaning that the millions of people will watch the same show on TV, millions of people will read the same newspaper, and so they trusted them. They trusted them. And in fact, the medium. What does the medium is the message? I saw it on TV, or as my grandma would say, I read it on the newspaper. You know, I read on the newspaper, and she pretty much believed that what the newspaper said, it was true. Now we don't live in an age of mass media anymore. We live in an age of individual media. Nobody sees on TV or read on the newspaper. Each of us has its own bot, its own data, its own website, its own chat. And so to have a common sense of truth and a common sense of trust, we have to rebuild trust. And I want to address this to you and to Ian, because I'm really glad in the future to tap your mind on this. Ian, a lot of time people ask me, for example, when we work with the European Union, they ask me, how do we rebuild trust? And I say, like, I cannot say this, what exactly I say, but I can say, like, what do I know? I'm a reporter, okay? I'm a teacher. I mean, rebuilding trust for me is something for rabbis, priests, political leaders, prophets. What do I know about rebuilding trust? All my life I was teaching, don't trust, be skeptical, double guess your government. So I guess we have to rebuild trust. And illiteracy, e-education in school, there will be students with us, but you are right. You know, Rectore, we are working on some cartoon here at the Data Lab in your university. We are trying to design a cartoon for elementary school on how to don't trust fake news that is simply a cartoon, some kind of, you know, drawing that the kids can bond. So we have to start really early on.
Thanks, Gianni. We do have another question, which is interesting, but this is very much in line with what we're discussing about. And the question comes from Ilario, who asks whether or not we have opportunity out of this pandemic, out of this crisis, to fight fake news. I think we touched upon some of them. Is there any other perspective, any other ideas you would like to share with the audience, since we are coming to a close?
I'll start. I mean, Gianni mentioned a few things that I'd like to reiterate and say that this is, he mentioned that, there's studies that show that fake news travels and lasts longer than real news, authentic news. That's primarily because it's more appealing or more triggering in terms of touching with people. And why is that? Because they have complete freedom. It's not grounded in truth. It's complete freedom to design things which can be appealing and triggering in terms of going forward. He also mentioned, and I don't think there's studies around it, but he mentioned a very important comment about the cost of misinformation, the cost to society. And I think and so he mentioned it in terms of deaths, in terms of misreporting information around clinical practices or using treatments, and it's actually led to deaths. And so I think there's a real opportunity to understand the cost. So in the same way as we look at the cost of not being green or sustainable, and how that, yes, there's costs to being green, but there's costs of not being green. I think that there's a big opportunity to look at the costs of misinformation, how much it hurts society, from healthcare outcomes to trade agreements to our life, our happiness, etc., etc. And I think that would be a wonderful piece of work when economists start trying to calculate the cost of information on society in terms of going forward, working with people in schools of journalism and social media in terms of going forward. And once you are able to, and remember, once those models come out, they will be imperfect. They will be first steps. They will be part of a learning process, and we build on it in terms of going forward. And so I think the unfortunate circumstances of COVID and what's come out will provide a lot of opportunity to measure the cost of information. And Gianni touched on that with a few examples, which I thought were very great. Thank you very much, Ian. Gianni, which would be your close on the opportunity that we can somehow exploit out of this crisis to fight fake news?
Thanks very much, Ian. Thanks very much, Rettore. I want to leave on some good news. And I saw the data of our friend Nando Pagnoncelli that does polling about the Italian public opinion. And Ian, I'm glad to report that the reputation of scientists, scholars, doctors, microbiologists, when Italians are asked, do you trust scientists? For the first time in the last couple of decades, the reputation is spiking. It's spiking a lot. Because, you know, when nobody dies of polio anymore, or nobody gets the polio like President Roosevelt did, and people don't see the president, you know, limping because he had polio, then people, at the time, people loved the vaccine. Then when nobody had any kind of infectious disease anymore, we started, you know, questioning vaccination, and then the no-vax movement started. But now the people are afraid that they die. They are afraid that they die of an unknown virus. Then the scientist, the doctor, became very popular again. So we have to work on that. We have to work on that and explain people that, you know, when you have to choose the gasoline for your car, propaganda is fine. Even in politics, it does less damage than when it comes to public health. And we have to work. We have to, I think, Rettore, we have to work. This is a project I was thinking while I was listening to you, Ian. We have to work on seeing exactly how many people we could have not lost if disinformation had been, you know, curbed earlier on.
Okay, thank you very much, Gianni. It's very, you know, this masterclass has been intense in terms of discussion, interesting and compelling. From thanks to both of you, and the kind of privileged post that you have in analyzing, studying, and researching upon misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and the likes. There's one piece of kind of, let me say, of information, or an important takeaway from today for me and for Lewis students or potential Lewis students I'd like to underline, which comes out of this interesting discussion. That is to say that when you know, as a university, we are particularly primed to create the conditions for students to learn following a logic of reasoning. So we're not showing through the university, but we would like students to build and develop the knowledge thanks to the interesting condition that we do. It's squared with what you mentioned regarding the importance of education starting from primary school, you know, up to the university and beyond. So logical reasoning vis-a-vis logic of truth, because as we know, there's always something that we need to search for getting and towards the truth. And in fact, the title of this class was Indifference towards Confronting Indifference towards Truth. So thanks again, it's been great, and I'd like to tell our audience that we're going to be back for our Lewis Masterclass this upcoming Thursday, 6:30 p.m. again. We're going to be having Cristina Laimo, who is an assistant professor here at Lewis University, who's going to be discussing about digital resilience with the CEO of Cisco Italy, Agostino Santoni. Thanks again, and see you on Thursday. Goodbye.
Grazie, ciao.
Ciao.